Today, we're really lucky and thankful to have with us Associate Dean of Admissions from Yale, Sunil Bald, and a professor at Yale who comes to us by way of Laura Penvent. And we also have with us Maxwell Sterling Miller. Maxwell is an amazing, very well-known New York City architect and has worked with Forster Tom portfolios for many, 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 many candidates. That said, we're going to get going here, and I'm going to give this over to Sunil Bald.
Can everybody hear me, first of all? Okay, good. Well, I'm delighted to be here. As Evan said, my name's Sunil, and I am an architect, and I've been teaching architecture first at a few schools since 1996. And for the last 16 years at Yale and the last 7 years, I've been the associate dean in charge of both the curriculum, but I also oversee admissions as part of that. So I thought what I would do is to just give you, as Evan said, the various trajectories towards a kind of Master's of Architecture degree, maybe talk about some of the assumptions that we have or that often applicants have that perhaps like takes them in the wrong direction when they are applying, just to sort of beware of those. But I'll also, because there are these multiple trajectories towards a graduate degree in architecture, I'm also going to talk a little bit about getting into, or what you might talk to a high school kid to in terms of that pathway, beginning that pathway. So anyway, so I have a kind of presentation. It's graphically challenged, which is embarrassing since I am an architect, but I'm going to show it nevertheless. So at least you have some written words to go with what I'm saying. So can everybody see my presentation or this black board that says architectural education on top of it? Okay.
Yeah, it looks good.
Okay, good. So I'm going to just talk, first of all, architectural education in general. And architectural education is in a funny place, perhaps, compared to other professional educations. In the long run, an architecture degree, if one is going to practice architecture, one needs to have a professional degree in architecture, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But even though it is a professional education, it really kind of sits between what I call the discipline and the profession. So the study of architecture and then being an architect on the right-hand side. And I think this is actually a very vital thing to remember when advising people who are thinking about going into architecture and how they might position themselves, that architectural education is by no means a technical education. Rather, it's a synthetic education. And so as architecture itself is a very kind of heterogeneous discipline, it incorporates the arts, the humanities, the sciences. Architectural education reflects that. It doesn't necessarily, it's not a kind of technical training to be an architect. That is really, even the most, I would say, technical schools still will situate themselves much more as a education that synthesizes the arts and the humanities in particular, and more recently the sciences as well, as issues of sustainability, building performance become part of the conversation. So that said, this is the first myth that one hears all the time, is I meet so many people when I say that I'm an architect, and they'll say, oh, I always wanted to be an architect, but I was terrible at math, so I decided to do something else. So you don't have to be good at math to be an architect. I actually am good at math, but that is not a requirement by any means. One only works with math in the smallest way in architecture school, as well as in being an architect. So this is in what I would say, maybe I just want to kind of go over the trajectory of how one moves from let's just say, this spectrum of being what I call a Lego kid. And what I mean by a Lego kid is the kid that has known they wanted to be an architect since they started playing with Legos when they were 3, 4 years old, to the other spectrum, which I call the Arca, which is someone like me who had never met an architect until my first day in graduate school. I studied biology as an undergrad at UC Santa Cruz, somehow got into Columbia because I had taken some architectural history classes that I liked, and I thought, oh, well, maybe this is a direction to go. So this is really a kind of broad spectrum of kids that that you might be talking to and advising the different trajectories that they might want to take. So at the top is the Bachelors in Architecture, which is a 5-year professional accredited degree. And then that BArch student can pursue a master's degree after they finish their undergraduate education and get a master's degree within 1 or 2 years. These master's degrees are not accredited degrees because it is assumed that if you have a Bachelor's of Architecture, you have an accredited degree. And what accreditation means is that it has been sanctioned by a national board, that it's a program that then will allow you, with then the requisite internship and exam, to practice architecture. So then these next 3 categories, which are called hard arc, soft arc, and non-arc, are what we at Yale will break down our applicants who are then applying into MArch programs. And a hard arc is and I'll go through this in more detail, is someone who has a Bachelor's of Arts or Bachelor of Science in Architecture. A soft arc is a Bachelor's of Arts in Architecture or Architectural Studies that tend to be at liberal arts colleges. And then the non-arc, someone who has a Bachelor's of Architecture or Bachelor's of Arts or Bachelor's of Science in any other discipline and may have had absolutely no experience or exposure to architecture. It's important to remember that when admissions, and we do this at Yale, and I'm quite sure that some of our peer institutions as well, we will look at all these different candidates in comparison to these small groups rather than in comparison to each other. So someone without a bachelor's degree, without any architectural experience, won't be judged against someone with lots of architectural experience. They're treated as 3 different pools. They all bring their own qualities to a master's education. The idea with master's architectural educations in the United States is that cross-pollination of these different backgrounds only improves the educational experience for all. So this is a chart that actually from a presentation that we do at Yale, which just talks about the curriculum in general. And it's important to know that the central part of every architectural discipline or every architectural education is architectural design, or what we call the studio. And the studio is where students are given problems, design problems to work out. And then these other 4 purple rectangles are what different schools classify them in different ways, but we describe these 4 areas as history theory, visualization, urbanism and landscape, and technology and practice. I show this just to show basically the core structure of an architectural education, and to show that it is very much this kind of synthetic field, that the goal is that for each of these 4 purple rectangles to feed the design process. So again, it's sort of synthesizing all these different types of information through a type of making and through a type of visual thinking. So now I'm just going to go through each of these different degree trajectories. So the first, many of you might already know this, so I apologize if it's being repetitive, but a Bachelor's of Architecture, as I said before, is an actual professional degree. So one can do a 5-year degree and then 3 years later, after interning, after exams, be an architect. So this is usually classified by 8 to 10 semesters of design studios in a semester system. It has a full slate of supporting courses as are required by national boards of architecture, things like structures, things like technology. And also, because it's an undergraduate education, one has to fold in general education requirements as well. So these are the types of programs that I would advise for the kid that just wants to be an architect. They know they want to, they're dead set on it. Usually to apply to these programs, you apply directly to the program, not the university. And many require a portfolio or some kind of visual entry requirement. Cooper Union, which is one of the best 5-year programs in the country, will give a question like, close your eyes, now draw what you see. You know, they'll do these kind of provocative questions to really understand how the applicant is thinking, more than to portray any kind of like good AutoCAD drawing. So the pros for this type of education is that graduate education is not required if you want to become an architect. And it's an intense and engaging experience. Architecture school, you're in the meat of it in a design studio. You form very close bonds. It's a very special education experience. The cons being that it really is a commitment. You basically limit your outside life and time and space for other types of exploration that a typical liberal arts undergraduate education might give you. So that now we're going to go into the 3, what I would say, hard arc, soft arc, and non-arc degrees. The first being a BA or BS in architecture. And so this is maybe talking to the student that is thinking of, again, applying to college. These programs are 4-year non-accredited degrees. They're often at public universities or art schools. There are 4 to 6 design studios that are still quite intensive, 8 to 12 hours a week of face time. It's a lighter load of supporting classes than a bachelor's of architecture. You still have the general education requirements. For these programs, you apply directly to the university and then are accepted to or declare your major after your first or second year. And the pros of these programs for a kid who might be really interested in architecture is it does give you a little more time, the student more time to choose the degree. Once they have more curricular options because it's not quite as intense an education. It doesn't have to pass that bar of being a professional education. And by doing this, you do take classes that if you do go to graduate school, you may be eligible for a year or so of advanced placement or course waivers that allow you to take different types of classes at a graduate level. The con is that graduate school is required, but graduate school in architecture is actually quite an amazing experience. And often it's at the graduate level that you really meet sort of leaders in the field. The next, which we will call soft architecture, and it's this kind of subtle distinction here, but it's somewhat quantifiable. So soft architects would be going to a 4-year, again, non-accredited degree. Most of these programs are in liberal arts colleges. So like Harvard, Yale, Princeton, the fancy ones, as well as smaller schools like Smith College or anyways, it's sort of that level of education. And these often, the curriculum will have 2 to 4 design studios that are not quite as intensely, 4 to 6 hours a week, and some supporting courses, but they skew more towards the humanities, things like architectural history rather than advanced structures. Again, the application process, you apply to university, you're same as before. The pros here, again, the same. You have an opportunity to choose this after your second year when you have a little bit more knowledge what an architectural education is. And especially a liberal arts college, it's a really amazing quality of undergraduate education that you're exposed to. And then the final is the non-arc. And I think this may be useful to introduce the non-arc as people that you might talk to in terms of advising them to go to graduate school. I would imagine that students who at the undergraduate level have had, whether it's a more intense background in architecture or even the soft arc, still in the university, they will have input from professors and so on that most the professors will be quite nuanced in terms of knowing the programs, how it suits. So they'll be getting guidance from professors, but for someone who, like myself, had no connection to an architect or architecture professor, these are the students that I think can use some help in terms of deciding what is the master's trajectory. And they're a little bit more at sea in the process of applying. So for these students who've had no architectural design studios in their undergraduate education, there is this question: what might help me know if I want to study architecture, and how do I get there? And my sort of 3 points of advice would be: first is to explore the discipline, explore architecture as a subject. Is it something that intrigues you? And then think about the profession second. So rather make a decision if this is something you want to pursue as an academic discipline, rather than, say, going to work at the architect's office down the street and seeing if you like it, because there's a broad range of ways you can practice or engage architecture, and your first interaction with that might not be the best one. Second point of advice would be to find opportunities to explore and develop and demonstrate visual thinking. And I say this again to emphasize the difference between demonstrating visual thinking and demonstrating technical acuity. So rather than, again, taking a seminar in an AutoCAD class where you learn a computer program, I would encourage students to take classes in studio art, which shows a kind of more creative way of thinking about visual thinking, and also begins to tell an admissions committee more about the individual than a cold computer drawing might. For students who have the ability or have the flexibility and perhaps the money at times, there are many summer architecture workshops that are offered by universities out here on the East Coast, Columbia, Harvard, Cornell, Princeton, and on the West Coast as well. Berkeley has a very good one. And these are 6-week intensive architecture programs that, for people without any experience, they're taught by young faculty, sometimes just recently graduated graduate students, and they give kids the opportunity to work out an architectural problem, also in an architecture studio environment. So they get a sense of what the education is like and if it's something that appeals to them as well. The final thing I would say is to not be intimidated to apply to an MArch program, even if you were like a statistics major, for instance, in college, and even if you have very little visual background. Like I said, admissions committees will look at these candidates in a very different way. If we're looking at someone who is a hard arc, we will look much more at a portfolio. If we're looking at someone who's a non-arc, we will read about their essay, we'll look at their grades, we'll look at their just sort of general academic ability. And the onus then is on the graduate program to actually give them the tools to prosper in architecture school. So I will stop sharing with that. And so that's my brief presentation. I hope I didn't go too far over. And so I'm going to hand it over to Max Miller now.
So I'm Max, and I'm what Sunil would say has a hard architecture background. So I did architecture undergrad at Victoria University in New Zealand, and am also a graduate of Columbia's Grad School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation, GSAP. And currently I work at one of New York City's largest real estate developers, building some of the world's tallest buildings. I also work with Forster Thomas on coaching undergrad and grad school candidates on their portfolios, resulting in admissions to some of the best schools around the world. So the portfolio itself is a requirement for undergrad and graduate programs, and is oftentimes the largest barrier to entry for applicants. So I'm going to talk to you about what makes a great architecture portfolio. So people applying, like Sunil mentioned, to architecture school can have architecture experience or no experience whatsoever, but it doesn't matter. They can still create a great portfolio. They just have to follow some kind of basic principles. So there's a lot that goes into it, but if I had to distill it, it would be down to these kind of 8 things. It'd be a story. That story is made up of chapters. It's got to show creativity, graphic consistency, good ones, clear and concise. There's range, there's depth, quality over quantity, and at the end it shows, the person's individuality. So the portfolio tells the story of an individual, and a good one shows their viewpoint, their likes, their dislikes, their interests, their body of work. And although there are some principles that kind of help convey, each portfolio is unique. And it's as unique as the person that created it, and that's the whole point. So this is a collection of covers that shows how different people, so anyway, this is a collection of portfolios that shows how different people are. There's cheery, there's tactful, there's moody, there's broody, there's process-oriented, there's modern. And so, like I said, it's a collection of stories. It is a story, and it's a collection of journeys. So it's short, and when it's put together, it creates the picture of a person. So the top is, so these are 2 title and table of contents from 2 different individuals. One has a liberal arts background that's on top, and the other one's got a technical background. And you can kind of just see from the layout itself, they're different. The top one reads a little bit more like a book, and the bottom, is kind of more like a manual. And that just kind of relates back to who they are as individuals. So each one is made up of chapters, and those chapters are generally about different projects. And so in general, someone should start strong. It should spark interest through maybe a render or a sketch. Middle, there's some substance with process, diagrams, iterations, and at the end, it packs a punch, and it should show off a beautiful end product. So this is this consultant, and he was bored at work, and he had a boring desk and kind of just like any corporate job, and he had access to a 3D printer. And so the starting image is kind of just this question of what could be there. The middle shows process and diagrams of how he got to his end result. And at the end, it's a beautiful image of what created, which was this cactus pot that was 3D printed, full of geometric facets. So architecture, after all, it's a creative endeavor, and the portfolio needs to show that someone can demonstrate their creativity in 2D, because it's also a 2D profession, even though it's about 3D. And so this is someone's timeline of their journey to architecture school. This person did not have an architecture background, but they were interested in architecture. And so it was all of the things that kind of led up to them applying to graduate school. So the work itself could also be creative. This is someone's trip to a noodle shop, and they drew kind of a process of the chef pulling noodles. And this could also be creative, the layout itself. So the title of this project was Refraction, and the model in the middle is the letter A in the word refraction. And in this project, process was just as important as the final product. And the layout kind of exemplifies that, giving equal weight across the bottom and across the top to show kind of where this person started and where they ended. So the next principle is graphic consistency, and I talk about this a lot. So this is to help the work shine instead of the layout shine. And so it's got some basic rules. White space, I always say white space is your friend. It's good to help the viewer to understand where to look and breathe. Templates, so that the information is in the same spot. Imagine if the page number jumped around all the time, top and bottom, it would be kind of hard to find your way around. And hierarchy, which is also important, so that the header is always in the same spot. Now, rules are meant to be broken, but it's got to be for a good reason. So this is just an example of kind of a good portfolio. There's a consistency per project that repeats itself. There's white space to help the viewer navigate. There's similar scales across the different projects versus this one, which started with the repetition, but kind of lost its rigidity, and there's lots of image sizes, which isn't always bad, but in this case, it was kind of chaotic. So just to kind of exemplify, what I mean with graphic consistency, here's a project, 2 different projects from one person. And so the project starts with a header and a text body on the left and kind of a sketch to get you interested. In the middle, there's diagrams showing development and process. The end is a final image of where this person ended up. And the next project, it's the same one that we saw before with the cactus, but there's text on the left, a teaser image on the right. The middle shows developmental iterations, more diagrams showing process, and a beautiful final image. So a portfolio should be clear and concise, and most schools will have a size and a page cap, and that doesn't mean that someone should try and fit in as much as humanly possible. So, many candidates will try and cram in everything that they thought and on one page, and they spent a lot of time thinking about something and they wanted to show. But a lot of times you can be clever and fit more with diagrams over text. And so, it's that old adage, an image is worth 1,000 words, right? So then, candidates will also freak out, what if there's not enough? And so the answer I tell them all the time is make something. And maybe there's something missing from the portfolio, a medium, a subject, an interest, a hobby, which gets into the next subject, which is range. And so, schools will want to see a range of mediums. Can this person draw? Can they render? Can they use Photoshop? Can they make a model? It's all important for the field, and maybe they don't have that in their background. So it's just a matter of pushing what this person can do, right? They might have a math background, but you don't want to see the same thing over and over and over. So it's also you can't just have range; it's got to have depth as well. And so only showing range can be a little chaotic. And so the school also wants to see that someone can think, they can analyze. And so it's just as important to show steps along the way, process, diagrams, analysis. The next point really speaks for itself, quality over quantity. I work a lot with people to push themselves to do the best work that they can do. And there's tons of tips and tricks in the book to do that. This, you can see that they added clouds and weather, and then they pushed the lighting, and then in the end they added window panes and materiality and collaged in some plants, and it's just a beautiful final image. Same thing here. People will have old work that they created. In this case, it's architecture, but it could be anything. But it's old work, created in undergrad. And if they're applying for a master's program, the point is you revisit your work and you try and push it so that you're putting together the best foot forward. And so if someone follows the principles, that I kind of outlined above, it should help the graphical layout recede in the background, and so that the work itself can shine. And more importantly, the individual themselves will shine. So with that, Sunil and I think, are open for questions. I need to stop sharing somehow. Evan.
That was amazing, guys. Thank you so much. That was so fascinating. And drinking from a fire hose, which is how we all enjoy it. Laura, do you have a question for Sunil?
There was just one question from Sherry that Sunil answered in the chat, and I don't know if you want to sort of expand on that a little bit. Or she says, you mentioned you don't have to be mathematical. Do you have to be an expert at the other aspects such as design?
No, I think there's, architecture admissions will look for just like a real range of individuals. And so that's where I guess I would maybe shy away from the word being an expert at anything, because it might funnel people towards a certain profile, and they're really ideally, it's a really wide profile. One thing I think that is especially applying to graduate school is more and more, I mean, we are, and I think a lot of people who do the same thing at our, peer schools, I know quite well, and is a little bit of life experience, especially between undergraduate and graduate school. Especially with international applicants, we get them coming right out of college, and they come into a graduate program, whether they have a B arc or whether they've done something completely different. Having at least a couple years out of school, or even 1 year out of school, can be really beneficial in terms of both the maturity level and also just a sense of really coming back to school because you really want to do architecture school. So that would be my one thing, but it's not really being an expert at something.
David,
okay, thank you.
Okay.
Okay, so what are there portfolio days, Max? Are there what happens in a summer program, or like when you work with somebody, do you usually, or are there a lot of people who come to you with nothing and they have to start from scratch? Explain sort of the process of what you work with a portfolio.
There's people from all sorts of backgrounds. So there's people that have, tons of architecture experience, or maybe have even been working for years, and they've got, a giant portfolio that just needs some, a second set of eyes on it. But there's also the exact opposite, where, someone will say, I have absolutely nothing, what do I do? And so, it's funny because both present different challenges. But with someone with no background, I mean, I think Sunil mentioned the different programs that they can do. And I will often do this exact same thing, which is, push them to try and do one of those intensives, because I think that it's helpful just to create a ton of work and be immersed in that atmosphere. And, also just double check that that's what you want to do for the rest of your life, right? So I think that that's extremely important. And then a lot of times that in itself isn't enough work to do a portfolio, and it kind of starts to look generic, meaning, a lot of people are going to be produced, a bunch of people get the same prompts, and so they're all producing not the same work because everyone's different, but you can kind of tell what work came out of that program. So I'll encourage people to set up assignments for themselves, and it depends on what they have. If they're really good at hand drawing, then we'll draw some things, but then it's also like, okay, maybe you're missing a range, like I talked about earlier, right? Maybe they're also interested in photography. Okay, well, go out and take some photos. And so it really comes down to the individual and what they have and they don't have, and how to put together a body of work that supports that. And you mentioned portfolio days. So portfolio days are more, and Sunil, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's more for specific schools will have them, and it's kind of for students to come with a portfolio and say, there'll be like current professors and students and things like that. And it'll be a chance for them to get their portfolio reviewed by someone that's in the field. So, you can go and I think I did one when I was applying way back in the day, but I think that there's pros and cons to it. The pro is that especially if you have no resources, it's helpful to get a second set of eyes. The con is you might talk to two people who don't really know much about you and they have 5 minutes, and so it's hard to get really valuable. It can be hard to get really valuable advice from those things.
Yeah, we don't have them at Yale, the portfolio days, but I have heard of other schools doing them. And yeah, I would support what Max said.
Okay, there's a question from Claudia. What can a person with an engineering background do to help them transition into architecture at the master's level?
I think that, we do have like a number of engineers that that apply. You know, it is in terms of the non-arc trajectory, that's not an uncommon one. And so, you know, they could go to Max and and you know, think about how they can kind of frame their story. And so there's the portfolio aspect. The things that I would encourage them to do, especially if they're within a pretty hard engineering program, is to, and many schools, I know we require it, is to take some architectural history or art history, and then also just some art classes or something that is shows maybe a complementary side to an engineering education.
I second that. And the other thing is to just make sure that they don't put together a portfolio of the different engineering projects that they worked on, because, you know, sometimes people will try and do that, but it reads a little bit like a technical manual. And the point of, you know, architecture is it's a creative endeavor. And so you want to show, you know, kind of how you communicate in 2D and a little bit more of creativity than the technical side.
Thank you. Lisa Temkin had asked about a, you know, house, for example, in Chicago, that's a very Mies van der Rohe town. It's Sullivan. Would the Chicago architecture programs reflect that? And Maxwell, would you send the same portfolio to every architecture school, even if one was more experimental and one was more, I don't know, practical? Or like, it's the portfolio an expression of your heart, or do you tailor it to a program?
I'll let Sunil answer the first one, and then I'll do the second one.
I think on the first, yeah, you know, there are different schools do have their different identities, and of course, a place like IIT, which, for those of you who don't know, is a kind of iconic architecture school building designed by Mies van der Rohe in Chicago. So, but at the same time, you know, times do change, and schools begin to transform as well. But still, you know, there are schools that are associated with different kind of ways of studying architecture. I think the differences are often a lot more nuanced. Schools get reputations, and sometimes those reputations are overblown. And I think that the way that the discipline is beginning to evolve as well, it makes those sort of less distinct from each other. One thing I would say is that most schools will have an open house period, and they have their 2 open houses. There's one typically in November for students that are interested. More and more of those have a virtual component, so you don't have to travel to the place. Like at Yale, ours is like all online now for the fall one. The spring one is for students who have been accepted. And so, of course, people should try to go to those in person. But for the first one, I think it's good to get a sense of maybe the different programs. I'll just say quickly about the portfolio is, well, actually, Max, why don't you answer first, and then I'll give my 2 cents.
Sure, I'd love to hear your 2 cents, but I'm glad you mentioned the open houses, because I encourage students to go to the open houses, because I feel like this is such a lame joke, but it's kind of like Hogwarts, and you got to choose your house and, you know, kind of where you belong. And you know, so I don't necessarily think it's the best idea that someone applies to, for example, like a super graph, what would you call that? You know, kind of like grasshopper and parametric program, like SciArc, and then also Notre Dame or something, right? And I think that, you know, a person needs to know kind of where they are headed. And that's not necessarily the case for everyone, but I do generally say that a portfolio is a really tough thing to do, and it's a giant endeavor, and, you know, it's a big time commitment. And so what I try and say is, you know, put together one portfolio that best exemplifies who you are, and then hopefully that sings and resonates to the school that, you know, that you end up matching with. And so that's in general the philosophy. And then, you know, sometimes people want to do little specific things that make it kind of unique to their application. And, you know, maybe they'll put a little something at the end, at the beginning, you know, that's unique to that school. But otherwise, in general, it should be, you know, 95% the same, I would say.
Yeah, I'd 100% agree. or agree. There's, I think it's important to remember that the institution is not reviewing the portfolio, but individuals are. And so even within an admissions committee at Yale, there's like a really wide range of people who are reviewing these. And at Yale, each portfolio is reviewed by 2 faculty and 1 student. So that's another kind of thing in the mix. So just what is, I think, important is to that not just the portfolio, but the whole application. You know, like when I was more involved with the everyday part, you know, I was responsible for doing the first cut of all applications. So in 5 days, I would look at 1,000 applications. And so when you're looking at that many, if the individual sticks out and you get to have a sense of who the individual is, it's much harder to say no. And so it's not just the portfolio, but I really can't overemphasize, because it usually gets short shrift in architectural admissions, is the essay. And to really spend time with that, so that there's really an understanding, because of the diversity of applicants too, it's really important to understand who it is that is applying.
There's a question here about Yale architecture. How long does it take to get a master's? Oh, no, it's not specifically Yale. It's just in general. For that non-arc person.
Yeah. So, you know, there's it's at Yale, it's 3 years. That is typically about the length for a MArch-1. And it depends on the school. For instance, a school like Yale is 3 years. And I'll just use the ones that are in the neighborhood, not to say that these are the only good architecture graduates programs, because there are many. They're not just the Ivy League ones, but there are many. But I'm going to use them because I know they're the ones I know best. So there's, for instance, Harvard is typically 3.5 years. And then because there's a thesis project, which is an extra semester. And then Princeton is 3 years for a non-arc. I mean, 3 years, but often 2 years for someone with the hard arc degree. They are a school that often gives advanced placement to people who, so their graduate school is only 2 years. Schools like Yale, Columbia, for instance, at least when I was there, does not give advanced placement. So no matter, the idea is that no matter where you're coming from, that kind of first year incubation of people with really diverse backgrounds, the idea that that is a very important part of a graduate education. So, but typically I would say for a non-arc, it's going to be 3 or 3.5 years.
And then after the degree is finished.
After the degree, yes. After the degree, there is an exam process that has evolved since I took it, and I had to do it in over 4 days in 36 hours. Now it's there, you can space it yourselves. They're all digitally given. You go to a test center. I think, I don't know how many parts there are. You might know better, Max.
Not offhand. I know there's
Okay.
multiple parts, and
Yeah.
I have friends that are still doing it. What is this? 7 years later. So.
Yeah. So, you know, you can be working as an architect. You know, I know many extremely famous architects that never got licensed. There are ways that you can practice without a license, but to be a licensed architect, you do need to work at an office or work for an accredited architect for 3 years and then pass this exam, which now you can take in these little increments pretty much right when you finish graduation. So the quickest is about 3 years. And even that, I would say maybe 2 years, because you can get credit for summer internships and things as well towards work experience.
Max, the examples you gave in your portfolio were all sort of building oriented and what you would think as traditional architecture, but there's public planning, there's urban planning, there's landscape architecture, there's interior design. Are the portfolios different for these? Should they really reflect the subject matter that you're going for, or is it more about, like, is there ever a portfolio that's just really about color and shape and it's not about form?
I think it's more, so it really is more about the person, right? So and each, I mean, so you're getting into landscape and interior, and sometimes specific programs will ask for specific things. So that has to be kept in mind. So it can't just be, if a school requires something, then you should listen to the prompt. I would say that's first and foremost. But so that's part A. But part B is kind of, some of the examples that I showed, for example, there was I would say about half of the examples were someone without an architecture background. And so like the consultant that, had a pot on his desk, right? And so that's, technically industrial design, right? But it was for an application into architecture school. Sometimes with landscape programs, you could do a very similar thing. I just had someone who had a decent amount of their portfolio on like ceramics that they had done over the summer, pots and things. And same thing with interiors, someone that did a ton of watercolors because that's just what they were interested in. No, I would say it doesn't necessarily need to be specific, but I think all of the same principles apply. So it's range, right? So it's not all just watercolors, or it's not all just ceramics. So yeah, I think that's how I approach it.
There's another question specifically for Yale from Dr. Lin, and I think you have your hand raised too. At Yale MR program, can Masters of Architecture students concentrate on the integration between architecture, design, and visualization?
Essentially, that is like because the design component is pretty much, so credit-wise, for instance, the design studio is 50% of each semester. In terms of real time, it might be closer to 75% in terms of what the students will be focusing on. So design and visualization, in most architecture programs, will be the core. There's not really a need to specialize in that. The other types of specializations that often happen, and different schools either consecrate these with concentrations or even joint degrees. At Yale, we have 2 joint degrees with 2 joint master's degrees. One was where you're there instead of 3 years, that you're there for 4. One is joint with the School of the Environment, which used to be the School of Forestry that Theodore Roosevelt started 100 years ago and has transformed into a School of Environmental Sciences. So that, especially for students who are interested in the range of sustainable strategies and thinking its integration with architecture. And that's something that is either, again, like you find in different schools as either part of the program. A University of Oregon, for instance, is very strong in integrating that within the program. The other is, at least at Yale, is with the School of Management. So it's a 4-year MArch and MBA where you get 2 masters after 4 years. Those students tend to go often more into things like development. So there are, to maybe obliquely respond to the question, there are different opportunities for specialization, I think, within the program. Typically, though, design and visualization will be the kind of core of the education, I'd say.
So my last question is for both of you, really. And the non-arc you talked about, if I had a student a couple of years ago who was despairing that she had no opportunity to take a CAD class, and was obsessed that CAD was the key to getting into an architecture program. And can you talk about I think a lot of us here today are going to have have high school applicants to undergrad programs who don't feel like they have earned the right to be considered for architecture. Can each of you talk a little bit to that person?
Yeah. I mean, I guess it goes back to the sort of first part of the presentation, at least my presentation, is that architecture school really is, it's not a technical education, and CAD courses in particular, I think, and the way that they are typically offered is more as a kind of technical program-based education. If it's not part of course, it's something that, you know, we actually at Yale, we don't even teach it. So and I don't think most architectures, or at least good architecture schools, do. What happens is basically the students are given the program and they're given a design problem, and they learn the program as they're doing the design problem. So I think Max could probably back me up on this. There's nothing worse than getting a portfolio that is just CAD plans of houses. It tells you sort of nothing about the applicant. So to those students who are non-arch, again, it's what can they, how can they represent themselves visually in a way that kind of best portrays who they are? And so anyways, Max.
I'll echo that, but I'll also say that, so there's two things. One is that CAD is kind of dying in the field. Like most of the architects that, you know, I work with, most people are in Revit and Rhino. So that's part one. So part two is that I would say, you know, in the portfolio, it's almost like architecture schools want to teach you, when you're there, the pieces of architecture. And so if you've got someone with no background in architecture, the worst thing they can do is try and pretend like they know architect. So, you know, the buckets that Sunil mentioned earlier, they're going to be put in that non-arch bucket. And when they're looking, or sorry, when people are reviewing their portfolio, they're going to say, why does this person, you know, they're in the non-arch bucket, but why do they have these CAD drawings? And really, you know, you want to shine by showing that you're creative, not by showing that you can do CAD, because it's really CAD is almost like a means to an end in the field, right? Like the first thing that you have to do, and the hardest part, is to show creativity and how to show your ideas in 2D. And then the easiest thing to do is, okay, well, now we're going to document it. So it's kind of like, you know, like writing an essay. You got to come up with an idea first, and then, you know, obviously you have to put pen to paper. And how you do that, there's many means and methods of how you do that, but the idea is most important.
Thank you.
There's a question here from Lisa Timken that is possibly a good question to sum up on, and that is, if both of you, either of you, Sunil, Max, feel like geographically there's a different focus on programs in different areas. And I think there was a hint of this early on talking about Chicago, but just as far as, I think maybe what Lisa means is across the continent, do different areas have different focuses in general?
Yes. I mean, I think from my perspective, for sure, but maybe for the level of a student going to study, those distinctions might be smaller. So I'm going to keep that in mind in my response. You know, the schools that are on the East Coast, these kind of, from Penn to Harvard, MIT, you know, there's this kind of like row of Ivy League schools where there's a lot of interchange between them in terms of faculty. One thing to keep in mind is that, especially in master's programs along the coasts, the majority of people teaching are adjunct professors, and they're often practicing architects. They often will teach at multiple schools. But it is a much more kind of like discursive type of education. The West Coast, especially beginning in the 1990s, 2000s, people that I went to school with at Columbia, there was an exodus to the West Coast at the time of the sort of digital proliferation in architecture. And so the Los Angeles schools in particular have still kind of embraced a much more sort of formal, technological, digital-based way of making that is maybe less discursive. I mean, that's a generalization, but I think that there is some truth to that. And Berkeley is its own thing, where there's always been a kind of social agenda. It still is. MIT actually used to have, there's a long historic connection between MIT and Berkeley that goes back to the 1950s in terms of the social responsibility in architecture. Oregon, like I said, has a kind of ecological approach. The schools in Chicago too, they are very sort of like building focused. And then, so I think there are distinctions in the different schools. In some ways they're geographically connected. In some ways it's more the particularities and histories of the place. So, yeah.
I would say that if someone is looking to apply to architecture programs, they should do their homework, because every school is different, and there are some like hubs, some geographic hubs, but even within them, there's specific schools that have their own agendas. And like Sunil mentioned earlier on, those agendas change, especially as faculty change or the dean changes, right? I'm thinking of the dean change at Yale, right? So I would also say that those open houses that he mentioned are extremely important to see that that school meshes with that person's ethos. And there's only one way to find out, and really that's the way.
Yeah. Just to add too, I think, one thing that is, especially with master's programs, I think it's much less important with bachelor's programs, but that you'll see that a lot of the most vibrant programs are in they're in urban areas. And that's because there is a sort of professional community that is pretty vibrant, that then has a real interchange with the schools. A way in the, myself, my own firm with my partner Yolanda Daniels, we both began teaching architecture, and that was a way we could sustain ourselves to develop our own practice without having to rely on clients, and develop a way that a certain trajectory and point of view. And so in those metropolitan areas and the interchange between school and the profession, it's something that's a very vibrant part of architecture school. It's not a really hermetic academic environment, but there is a lot of movement in and out. And so when advising someone to a master's program, I think its relationship to its urban context, or sometimes lack of urban context, is something to consider.
That's extremely important. And the other thing I would say is that these programs are very long programs, right? Like 3 years after you've finished a 4-year degree, you're in school 7 years by the time you're done. So it's equally as important that this person thinks about if they can, or if they like that city for the next 3 years of their life, right? Cornell, for example, like, do you want to be in Ithaca for 3 years of your adult life? And there's nothing to say that's bad about that school. It just happens to be where it's located. So versus, New York City or a hub. So anyway, I think.
Thank you guys so much for this talk today.